everyone. Why is there always so many seats available at the back of the, at the front of the bus here and at the back of the bus on the bus? So what I'm talking about today is adapting to climate change and how we talk about doing that. There we go. So the structure of the talk overall, we'll look at future narratives, we'll look at why it's important that we consider how the future narratives are formed and delivered, about finding some focus amongst a question that's bigger than the world, listening to a few of the voices that we have who have been speaking on this topic, and looking a little bit about future societies and future climates and how they'll develop together. There we go. So this particular study, my PhD topic, began really with a conversation in an elevator. I'm a shy, quiet, retiring person, so of course I was talking to the person in the elevator and mentioned that I did science communication around adapting to climate change. And he said, I'm only one person. How can I adapt to climate change? And then he got out of the lift. And I really had no ready answer for that question. I thought about it for quite a long time. And it's really been the underpinning of the work I've been doing to try to figure out what is the question that could be developed into. So of course when you do a PhD, things have to be a bit more nuanced for a research question. So it became, what narratives do individuals use to describe their personal futures when taking into account likely climate change impacts? And of course that has some other aspects that come together. Does the future climate become characterized as dangerous? And how would that affect your willingness to discuss it, to picture the future, and to make changes that might relate to it? And is the unknown or the unfamiliar nature of anticipated climate impacts a barrier to developing some kind of a future climate narrative? And what strategies might people use to manage that? And if to some extent the future has to be imagined, where does the knowledge of climate change projections fit into that imagination? And what personal coping strategies and imagined adaptations come to play in those narratives as the future unfolds? Because not only do we change over time, but the impacts from climate change will also have ongoing impacts, and this story will continue to evolve. So does it matter that we talk about climate change? Because you can see, it's going to affect different people in very different ways, and my perception of it may not matter so much to you or to you in terms of how that's going to work for us going into the future. But if we're going to come up with any kind of a vision that we can share and work together as societies, then yes, I think so. So a good article looking at climate change in terms of cultural anthropology brought out a number of points that I'll make to you now. So the culture frames our perception, our understanding, and our experience, and our response to the world. That climate change entails movement away from what you know towards something that you don't know, and that uncertain future. What we recall, what we recognize, and the things that we envision rest on the cultural models that we make. So those conversations develop and reinforce and shape those cultural awarenesses over time. And that individual and collective adaptation are shaped by our common ideas. And what we consider to be believable or desirable or feasible and certainly acceptable will change over time and can change very much depending on who you're with, as we know from people who engage in interesting behavior with one group of friends and very different behavior with somebody else. So it's a big question. It's a big sky question. So this is the Brisbane River in the city of Brisbane, Queensland, Australia, where I live. And there's a lot of different aspects of this, that's too big. We need to narrow it down and come up with some kind of focus. So we could look at infrastructure, we could look at roads, we could look at riparian revegetation, we could look at the ecosystems that exist. But in order to focus thinking, I needed to get away from just the blue sky thinking and into something that was a bit more nuanced. So 3 main areas really emerged out of the literature review that I was doing. Looking at climate change, looking at narrative communication, and looking at future thinking. Having worked for 5 years doing science communication for research organizations that actually research adapting to climate change, I was pretty familiar with some of the underpinnings of climate change and narrative communication. But I hadn't really understood the importance of future thinking in all of that. I think that from a scientific perspective, it's easy to undervalue that, because really what you're looking at is just a progression of the topics that you know. Thinking about the future is not well grounded in the physical sciences. And then if we look at how we're going to see all of those things, is it the big question that takes in the whole city, or is it really something that's very personal? And one of the things I realized in working with a lot of scientists is that scientists are people too. And a lot of the way that they would interpret the information or deal with it or communicate it to others would really be idiosyncratic. It would vary a lot depending on the individual. And that it might be wise for us to look a little bit, not just on the policy level, on the very broad level of these questions, but maybe to tackle it from that individual level and work outward from that. So just picking three important bits of literature, the IPCC is the fundamental information source for all things climate, and only in the most recent reports have they brought in a chapter that deals with near-term climate change, which they've calibrated as being 2016 to 2035, the next 20 years. And they say that they're doing that because of a recognition of the importance to decision makers in government and industry. So that was the focus for the study I'm doing as well, so it'll match up with that. If we look at the issue of narrative communication, Mary Catherine Bateson, who's a noted ethnographer, says that she believes that the rich and curious exchange of stories, not just in print but in conversation, and the willingness to listen to alternative stories offer the best hope for a society prepared effectively to face the future. And it's that effectively to face the future that's something that we're trying to tackle really from a lot of different directions. And the question of foresight or future thinking, this may seem a bit circular at first, but foresight is both a social construction and a mechanism for social construction. So not only is the idea of looking into the future an idea that we create together, but by practicing looking into the future, we start to shape how it is that that future is shaped. So that all seemed a bit stable and static, and there's three things. It just sits there. That's very nice and handy. But where do we acknowledge the fact that the climate's changing? And where do we acknowledge the passage of 20 years? So I realized that by having a person, a viewpoint outside of that, it was a useful pivot point, because over 20 years we change from the inside and the outside, and all of the components as they relate to one another keeps changing as well. So in the focus of the literature review, there were some things that came for me. The overlaps of these places started to be the interesting point. So I've developed a series of typologies. And so if I look at the overlap between climate change and narrative communication, which is really where I've been working for the past few years, I characterize that as dangerous futures, because that's really been characterized very much in the literature, television discussion. It's big, it's bad, and doom and gloom became one word. I don't know, and it's always associated with climate change. Exactly why that one works is somebody else's PhD. If we look instead at the overlap between climate change and future thinking, thinking about the future with the climate changing, I characterize this as the unfamiliar future. We don't know what aspects of today are like today because the climate's the way it is. What aspects will be different if the climate's different? Some things will be the same. Picking those things apart and understanding the first order impacts and then the things that follow on from those is not something that we're used to doing. I was in Scandinavia at one point and people had rose bushes. And rose bushes rot very easily, as you're probably aware, if it's too damp. But they were in a drought. But nobody thought to mulch the rose bushes. You just don't do that. Something as simple as this, these very unfamiliar things you haven't dealt with before, can be the kinds of things that will make it difficult or trip us up as we go forward into the future. So if we park climate change for a minute and just consider the fact that over the next 20 years, each one of us will be 20 years older. So you can go from 20 to 40 or 30 to 50 or 40 to 60. And in that time, it's this imagined future. And you might think about how your life will go. And it's a practice that we have available to us now, although the older you get, the less you imagine the next 20 years, in my estimation. And then the unfolding futures. So from the personal perspective, how do we change on the inside over that time? And then how does the world change around us over that time? I found that many people who were working on mitigation of CO2 emissions would come up with plans. And I would say, this is amazing. You know, you figured all this stuff out over the next 20 years. How do you bring in the impacts from climate change? And they said, what do you mean? Well, don't you picture the climate is changing? Oh, that would make it too complicated. So this unfolding futures aspect turns out to be fairly important and not an easy one to bring into the conversation. So let's look at some voices, some ways that these typologies might be playing out. The research that I'm doing, I'm interviewing 15 people in Canada, 15 people in Australia. Most of the interviews are conducted now. The selection criteria for these participants are people who already have a high degree of knowledge of climate change. So either they're people who are researchers or policymakers or practitioners who apply the information. So there isn't a question in the usual communication sense of making sure they've got the information. If anybody's going to know this stuff, these are the people. So my question to them is, parking your work to one side at the moment, how do you talk to family and friends about climate change? So these are the sorts of things that we see in the media. That typology of dangerous futures. So this is one of my participants from Australia. We talk more about reducing emissions than adaptation when I asked him about how does he talk to family and friends. And I have to say that cuts across all the conversations I have with people, even though professionally my focus is much more on adaptation than mitigation. So it's interesting. I think, as you said before, the conversation just naturally drifts back to mitigation. It's in the newspapers and other places. The politicians are talking about it all the time. It's the thing that's most contentious. And in Australia in particular, I think it's the thing that's most familiar. Conversation tends to stop there. I'm not getting quite the same sense of it here in Canada, but I haven't really looked through the interviews as much. Looking at that overlap between climate change and future thinking, the unfamiliar futures typology. A lot of these things are about people who are prepared to look into the future and actually see possibilities that are unpleasant and actually think beyond those. Some people do live in really hot places, so the question is, okay, if I'm going to end up there, how would I live? What would I live like? And so in dealing with the unfamiliar, I'm finding there's a number of people who are looking for analogies. They're saying, well, if I'm looking at living in a hot place, why don't I talk to people who do that now, and maybe I can use their lessons to go forward, which is a reasonable strategy. I think the one thing it tends to minimize is the amount of instability that you might find in that situation. You're taking a nice, stable, intact situation and comparing it to a nice other stable, intact situation, not one that actually is going through tumultuous transitions. In terms of the imagined futures typology, it's a question of, can we imagine things being much different than they are today? And in some cases we can, and that could be a great strength. I have to say, looking through the media to find a positive story like this, it did take a while. I had to keep going. Most of it was about why that wasn't working. So you're talking about successful people imagining a shared future under litigation, or it's been destroyed, or it didn't happen. So I think it's not so much that it doesn't happen, it's that it's not news if it works. So another participant from Australia, I think having good people skills will be a really important part of it. This is about the characteristics that they like to foster in their own children going into the future. My vision for the future is one where we're more collaborative, but less. I think resilience for communities and for families will evolve. Not being isolationist, but creating networks that are cooperative, but can negotiate appropriate and maybe firm boundaries at time when necessary, in ways that doesn't threaten the ongoing cooperation. So it was interesting to me that this person, when asked the kinds of skills they thought their children might need, they were going into being able to be a leader, being a thought leader, being able to help people come to similar ideas and move forward. And for them, it was a very important thing that it be a collaborative and community process. So the unfolding futures typology is really the one where the changes get felt. And it's not just climate change. Clearly, many changes will go on over 20 years. Many changes have gone over the past 20 years. Technologies, biodiversity changes in any case. But one said, so even without climate change, global fisheries look pretty bloody awful. Australian. And I find it hard to imagine that it's going to play out in any other way. So I think we'll manage, and we'll end up with a sort of new normal, with natural systems that are not where they used to be. But if we do it right, we'll still be pretty natural, actually. But the transition time for that could well be 100 years. So could be a messy interval. It's an interesting bit of understatement. These aren't conversations that people are generally having. I videotape my interviews. I could just audio record and transcribe and have words on a page. But what I'm finding is it's those times of pause where people aren't saying anything because they're really articulating this for the first time. In Australia in particular, I'm finding that we're not having this conversation. This is you know, not an emergent conversation, it's vapor. It's a conversation yet to be had. Of the 14 people I've interviewed now in Canada, I found it much more common for there to be some kind of familiar conversation that includes adaptation, but in neither case do I see any move to make any actual changes in behavior, particularly at this point. So how do we imagine the future? How we used to imagine the future? How we imagine the future now? So unfortunately, a lot of these people are really busy and they don't see movies. So when I say, so what movies have you seen that give you an idea of what this might be? I'm not getting too many answers. But Elysium's come up. The Day After Tomorrow's come up. But they tend to be much less of a flying car and much more of a dystopian future. So one of the things that comes from looking at this information is this idea about how we actually can look at the future in both societies and in the climate. And this is from a 1998 report by the UN Environment Program. And I think it's interesting here what we've got is climate scenarios across the top, socioeconomic scenarios down the side, moving from current climate and current society to future climate and future society. However, what we tend to imagine is the current society with the future climate, or the current climate with the future society. However, only interactions in the same time frame will ever actually occur in reality. Now, to borrow from the Australian, this may seem bloody obvious, but it's not being acted out. Intellectually, we're sitting here looking at the idea, that's one thing. But in the course of a day, and especially on a personal level where you're looking at your own life, it doesn't tend to be as programmatic. It's not as organized or arranged as it would be if you're coming up with a policy instrument. This seems to be a bit of a pivot point of where things are getting stuck a little bit. That it's an extreme act of imagination to go ahead and say, well, I bring all this information together, where do I take it? And it's not within the job that these people have been asked to do. I would say out of the 30 people, there's maybe 6 who would tell me that they actually talk to their family and friends about this and have a regular discussion and have ideas around it. And many others look at me telling me about they've got a plan B. Well, what does your wife think your plan B if you need to leave the city you live in? We've never talked about it. Okay. That might be interesting if it comes up. Someone else who was, a friend was clearing a block of land that they'd bought with a house on it in an area that had a lot of trees around it, in an area that had recently had some significant bushfires in Australia. And they had decided they were helping one another to clear all of this fire break around the house. Well, that would be the perfect time to talk about how this will change over time with climate change. The person I was interviewing dealt with climate communication as their work. That's funny, she said, you know, it would be, wouldn't it? No, we didn't talk about it at all. And I said, well, is this, you know, we talked about there's people in the fold and people out of the fold. Some people you can't have that conversation with. They're just not, you know, willing to or ready to consider climate change as being real and immediate. And she looked at me for a minute and she said, we work together. That is weird, isn't it? So I had a number of those sorts of conversations with people where the fact that it didn't seem to be consistent with other parts of them really hadn't come up yet. So I have 2.5-minute video. This is people's voices from a conference. I don't identify the people who are respondents in my research because they have professional reputations and it would get in the way that they couldn't be freely talking about what they might have as a personal opinion. But I went to a conference in Tasmania called Unnatural Futures, and it was people in humanities and fine arts. And I thought they might have some more out there creative views of how the future would play out with climate change. And they weren't as out there as I thought. And I will apologize now for the sound quality in some of it because I'm learning. Let's see how we do. Probably big enough. Really, the only people that I've spoken to who have those kind of scenarios tend to worry me a little bit because they, I mean, and these are people who have actually relocated because of climate change, because of anxieties about water. Because I So the interesting thing for me on that level, for one aspect of it, was that as it happened, the ages went from older to younger, and they went from this is beyond belief, terrible, to she'll be right. And so some of it was an element of exposure, I think, and some of it's an element of the fellow at the end who was saying, but I'll be fine because I know it's happening. Even as I was sitting there, I kept thinking, he's 22, he's 22, he's 22. That he had that sense of invulnerability that he probably carries into all kinds of situations. So it's not just about the aspect of climate change. But, he does live in a city that gets up to 40 degrees now. And so it's interesting for me to hear him basically minimize the fact that that would become a regular moderate day's temperature, quite possibly in the future. So interesting perspectives. Anyway, that's my presentation, and I'd really be interested in hearing questions or thoughts from anyone. Yes, please. So I chose Canada and Australia specifically for a couple of reasons. They're Commonwealth countries. They have amazingly similar cultures, considering the fact that they're on opposite sides of the planet. Governance systems are quite similar, and at least at the moment, the ruling political party have very similar bents. And then also the fact that we're resource-based economies, that we're used to dealing with raw materials rather than value-added. So those things. The other thing is that I could have done it just within Australia, but then it would have been about Australia, and I didn't want it to just be about Australia. So by having two countries that were fairly aligned, I didn't have to deal with a lot of differences in terms of cultural backgrounds, but there was enough diversity. And I'm surprised that I was concerned that just by being in BC, I wasn't going to do Canada, I was going to be doing BC, and BC is its own particular culture. Or set of cultures. So last week I went to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities conference in London, Ontario, which was national, but it was their Sustainable Communities conference, and that allowed me to interview people from Quebec, Ontario, Alberta, and Nova Scotia as well. So there was a bit more breadth in that. And at the same time, not just the countries, but choosing not just to use scientists, because then it would be about scientists. So because it's on an individual level, these aspects of culture actually play out significantly. And I am finding that there's a fair amount of literature that shows that people aren't adapting to climate change yet because really it hasn't started. They're adapting to the fear of climate change on a psychological level, and on a practical level in planning, they're adapting to changes in policy instruments. So one of the differences between Canada and Australia is that in Canada, a number of the regions have been asked to prepare climate adaptation plans, certainly in the Maritimes. And so people know about that. It's on their to-do list. How much they've internalized what that means, I don't know, but it's an allowable piece of conversation. In Australia, the conversation gets stopped very much on, yeah, but there's lots of people who don't believe in this. And that actually is used pretty significantly to stop the conversation from getting on to, yes, so, but what are we going to do about it? So, yeah. Well, as you say that, the one particular person that I interviewed in Australia came from a refugee family, and it was very important that he not be identified. There were a number of times in the conversation where he said, if I answer this question, people can figure out who I am. And so he knew to be worried about that. And it was a different conversation. It was a much darker conversation. And that's one of the things that brings up for me is that within cultures, you know, they're not, you know, you take the bus down Hastings Street. It is not homogenous. We tend to have an assumption that in a highly developed nation that we're going to be fine because we've got resources. And we can easily forget the fact that those resources are not evenly distributed even within a wealthy country. But the other thing is that this is a beginning. You know, I say the question's this big, the PhD's this big, so it's my doorway in. I'd also like to do a whole series with just people who are involved in arts and artistic expressions, and also First Nations people. So, yes? So interestingly, so when you look at actually the impact of being asked these questions is I've had a number of people come back to me saying, gee, it's too bad you don't have the capacity to do follow-up studies and to talk to these people 2 or 3 times or to talk to them and then talk to them again in a couple of months. Because I've had people come back to me, send me emails, or I've met them professionally saying, since I've talked to you, I've now had a conversation with my wife about that, or I've gone ahead and talked to other people about this, and it does seem to open it up a bit. I don't know if that's going to be the same kind of difference in Canada, but I've got a feeling that it will be, because it's not just a matter of saying there's a plan, we all have to do the plan, we can talk about the plan. But when I talk to people about, there was somebody whose family has a family business on a river in Saskatchewan, and she was very concerned about the fact that the river's flooding, it's going to flood, you know, a lot more, and they're expanding the business. So she hasn't really sat her family down and said, I need you guys to think about this in a whole different way. I'm really worried about this. Because they're difficult conversations, and they actually challenge, you know, she's the youngest child, and so she doesn't have that kind of weight in the family, and it would change her whole relationship. So one of the things about taking our topic and then, you know, using that with a lot of other people is that if we privilege this information over all sorts of other things that tell us how we're supposed to act with people, then I like to joke I can clear a room at a party. Yes? It's an interesting thing whether I think that people will not envision a different future because they want to maintain status quo. One of the pieces of literature review that I did showed me that when we imagine the future and we talk about it, think about the future, the part of our brain that's activated is memory. And so we're pretty well hardwired to see the future as an extension of the past. And one of the motivations for doing this particular project, and also I'm looking at trying to make a film that might in the end facilitate people having this kind of conversation, is that if you don't see people talking about adapting to climate change, then when I start to think about the future, I don't have a consistent picture in my head, except for those dystopian movies, about what it might be like. So yeah, I think that it is a difficult thing, and one of the sort of workarounds with that could be to initiate having positive conversations about how we're going to deal with some really difficult times. One of the first climatologists I worked with early on came back from a meeting with the comms people for the organization, who took his press release about how incredibly bad this was and wanted to put a good news bit at the end. And he was really angry about that. He said, there is no good news. And that was his perspective on it. And it was very, very, important for him that people understood how incredibly dire this was. It's only good news in the context of some really bad news. So, John? So it's an interesting one, and I do want to facilitate people having this kind of conversation. But I think for me it's also very important that it's not with the agenda of having them do the behavior I think that they should be doing. Having said that, the behavior I think they should be doing is talking about it more, so maybe I'm tripping myself up there. The initial communication that came out of the discovery that the climate was changing and this was a very real thing came through physical scientists who didn't have any background in social science particularly. And so we can get a lot closer to the Goldilocks spot than they've been. But it's been hijacked in so many ways by so many different interests that it's difficult to try to find something that's sort of positive neutral. So for me, the thing is, if I can give you numbers and I can show you that it's going to get warmer, and I can show you, this like small bits of information, and then the question is, I don't have to tell you how big and bad that is. We need to have a conversation and say, what do you think that's going to be like? How do you picture that? What do you think it means in your town? And that those are the sorts of things that actually need to be significant engagement processes to find a really meaningful Goldilocks spot for a whole bunch of different people. Yeah. I guess that my first thought looking at these two assumptions that are probably buried in the work or very slightly buried in the work. One is that there is a dark future that we're looking at, and the other is that having these conversations is a good thing. So the researcher is a person too. So I guess part of the thing is that I do have the gray hair coefficient, and I am too one of the people who, in that short video would have been appearing at the first. And this is information that came to me based on there'll be big changes, there'll be discontinuities. So that is my personal perspective. Yes. So I guess the things that come to me for that is that the conversations might not need to be so much specifically about climate change, but that I think that as we have our conversations about what we're planning to do over the next 20 years, or the things that are within the sphere of influence of an average person, you know, buying a house, choosing a career, investing in education, to not incorporate the information that's available about how the risks associated with those things are the parts that I find a concern. We bought a house in Brisbane, which is, you know, a river city, and the river flooded in 2011 substantially. It had flooded as well in 1974, and there's flood maps available you could look at. And because of the work that I do and because of my mindset, I looked at those flood maps before I bought a house. It flooded 6 months after we bought the house. Could easily have been, you know, 10, 15 years later. But as it happened, it was 6 months later. So because of having conversations with some other friends around things like that, they were also more likely to be looking at incorporating that information or those ideas. And I guess the other aspect about this that I'm not seeing happening is people who are dealing with projected changes or long-term planning for infrastructure, for, you know, for long-term investments, are, if they're not including the impacts from climate change in that, if it's too hard to think about or too complicated to build in, then I question the value of all this information that we are putting out in terms of climate change, having spent some time communicating the research on adapting to climate change, and realized that the people who were doing the research on adapting to climate change weren't really picturing the climate changing. It seemed to be a fundamental issue. And so it's not that we need to worry about it every day. To me, the analogy is with aging. You know, every person in this room was going to die at some point. But you don't wake up every morning thinking about that. You can't. You've got things to do, people to be, jokes to tell, you know. It's a life to live, and you need to do that. But in terms of preparing for old age, most of us don't only do it because the government makes us. It's been legislated. You have to put some money aside, or your employer does, however that works out. So this whole question of how you see aging is not a small part of this. I realized when I parked climate change, and we're really just looking at thinking about the future in the next 20 years, then it was much easier to look at the questions, because then it wasn't colored by my own biases around climate change and booga booga and how big and difficult that is. But yeah, the day that some scientist said to me, hey, we're all dying anyway, don't worry about it, I had to take a minute and go, oh yeah, right, perspective. Yes? Because it's not going to affect you personally.
It's not going to, because I live in a society that actually has the institutions developed to manage. If I were living in Kiribati, or some small disadvantaged region, or maybe if I were living on the coast somewhere in a port state that gets hammered by cyclones every day. But I just don't see, any reason for this discussion within societies like Canada or Australia.
It's an interesting point. I think it's a valid point that, you know, if we're in a situation where we're fairly well insulated and isolated from the impacts of this, why does it have to be a big deal for each of us? And I have to say that my thesis will have a chapter on cosmopolitanism, which is my new word. But the idea that we're a global family, that we're a global society, that one country is not separate from another country. So there's a question of what's your sphere of concern. I've talked to people in Victoria. So do you care about Victoria? You care about Vancouver Island? But no. So on a very personal level, the people on Vancouver Island get 5% of their food grown locally. So if they get cut off, or if California is having too much trouble supplying the food that they eat, the question is, how many different ways do you want to fry mushrooms? So there's an issue in terms of seeing ourselves as being separate from others when we forget that the level of globalization that's throughout our whole economy is so high that we don't live in that isolation, you know.
But then if we start further, in fact, globalization actually makes us less vulnerable because we get mushrooms from China, right? I get my grapes from Chile. I pick up oranges from New Zealand. I don't know. All of
Yeah, my asparagus came from Peru.
So the vulnerability is in fact lower than one might imagine.
So if you're not able to get those things because your trading partners are actually the ones who are in strife,
I'll eat Lithium. I won't eat orange.
well, then you're going to be very adaptable and flexible and you'll manage fine. And one of the things I did notice in the people that I talked to is, once again, what I call the gray hair coefficient, is that a lot of these people were the global elite, like you. Educated, employed, with some resources, and in terms of people who are going to be able to withstand shock 1, shock 2, shock 3, shock 4, pretty well set up for those things.
But I'm arguing that everyone in this city, right? Everyone.
Have you taken the bus down Hastings Street?
Oh, I mean, you know, that I understand that there are marginal populations, right?
But you didn't just a minute ago.
No, there are marginal populations, but the effect, the marginality doesn't emerge from climate change. It's a whole host of other issues that actually underlie the marginality. So then you can't.
But the same is true in Kiribati. You know, those are societies that have very few options. They have no place else to go. They have very limited economy. It's not just that a big wave's going to overtop the island. It's that they are already quite vulnerable. And so there's a whole discussion about the fact that the very vulnerable are the ones we should, you know, if we're going to do something to help those poor people over there. And it may well be that in your lifetime, there's not that much that you have to worry about. And I'm not saying that you have to worry about it. I'm just finding it interesting that we can't even talk about it.
Yeah, all I'm saying is, I know what you're saying, but all I'm saying is that maybe it's in the wrong place that you're asking this question. That Canada and Australia are not the locations to really ask these questions. I would rather go to Fiji, right? Or Philippines that got hammered by Hurricane Haiyan. And those are the people who might express these sentiments in a different way. So comparison more appropriately might be Australia, which is a little bit more vulnerable to climate fire, floods, and so on, versus a poor Pacific Island state, and there you might start to see sort of some kind of.
No, it's a valid point. It's actually one I find quite interesting around the whole project in general. Yeah. I will say that a handful of the people I interviewed in Australia who have the capacity are looking at moving to another country, specifically in response to climate change. I'm just saying this is they have articulated it from their perspective, which is clearly, you know, in 15 people, there's 15 different perspectives, and some people feel more vulnerable to this, and some people feel less vulnerable to this, given the same sort of information. And, you know, you have a perspective which is completely valid for you, and this conversation is not one that you particularly need to engage in. But for other people who feel more vulnerable about this or see it as being more immediate, it might be useful for them to be able to talk about it. To me, what I find intriguing is not whether or not it's a conversation you couldn't be bothered having. It's intriguing that it's a conversation that would, on an even playing field, simply arise, and it's not arising as a conversation. So there's something there. I'm curious about what is it there that you can't just sit down and talk about this. And there's also the edges of weather, you know, whether you're looking at weather events. We've had tropical cyclones in Queensland historically, but we've never had this many Category 5s in a short time. And my roof was replaced just before we came over here. But then we were worried that it might come off again last week because a tropical cyclone was getting too close. So maybe it's more immediate. Well, New Zealand's come up. You got to wonder about earthquakes, but New Zealand came up. And actually is the first person who was talking in the film, moving from other parts of Australia to Tasmania is the poster child for the place you want to move to. Tasmania has no infrastructure or capacity and is going to become increasingly drier. So it sounds good right now, but they're imagining the Tasmania of today while they're considering the move for the Tasmania of tomorrow. So, okay, yeah. Plausible. Yep. In fact, in terms of, I did ask the participants if they had any stories, movies that they might relate to. I've definitely chosen a group of people who, one of the commonalities is that they really all privilege the IPCC as a source of information, really. You know, if you're looking at the kind of work that they do, it's all based on IPCC projections. As a science communicator, I can tell you that a scientist does not want the word fiction associated with his work in any way, shape, or form. And that's actually one of the issues that happens when you're trying to come up with creative visualizations for the future. It would be very interesting, I think, to do a further study with, you know, different sets of people and look at how they're talking about it in different ways. Initially, I also was interested in the idea of doing this with another Commonwealth country that was more vulnerable, such as Fiji, now that they're in the Commonwealth again, because they weren't when I started. They were on the bad boy list. To deal with places where it's acknowledged as being much more immediate and vulnerable. But that was beyond the capacity of doing the PhD. Thank you.